Well, Minister Sitharaman, we have a lot to talk about. Thank you, Dr. Coulibaly, for setting the stage so nicely. This should be a moment of triumph for India at one level, Minister Sitharaman. The performance in the Indian economy has been very good, at least relatively speaking, compared to most of the other major economies. This morning, the IMF dented that triumphalism a little bit by pushing down the growth rate for 21-22 to 6.8%, although it still looks like next year India is likely to be one of the best performing major economies in the world. So perhaps we should give you an opportunity to take a lap of triumph. What is it that India is doing right that has led to this, and what do you see as the short-term growth prospects over the next year or two?
Well, one didn't anticipate the pandemic, but it's been an attempt by the Prime Minister to, with a great deal of energy, to push the digitalization of the Indian economy since 2014. The effort had started earlier also, but the pace at which we tried covering various sectors of activities, getting the optical fibers, going into the panchayat level, making sure that people were able to access it and so on, bringing it into their daily lives. So digitalization started in right earnest 2014 onwards. Again, financial inclusion was another thing which was ramped up. Again, no one knew that there's going to be a pandemic. Much before 2014, you also had this digital identity number in the name of Aadhaar. That got speeded up as well. So if all this happened in the name of digitalizing Indian economy, what we had inherited in 2014 required a lot of cleansing, cleaning up, correction, being brought in, looking at the health of institutions, and so on. Now, all this applied to all the Indian banks, public sector. So you had to clean up the banks, understand why they had so many NPAs, decide on handling the NPAs without hurting the balance sheet, infuse money into the banks to have them enough funds for carrying on with their developmental and growth related activities. So that was another major activity which was going on. But then with all this coming in, when the pandemic came, no one knew how to handle it. I'm sure no part of the world can claim that we knew how to handle it. And at that time, no one had the vaccine either. So giving relief, providing immediate some kind of a succor, were all instantly affected because of the digitalization which had happened already. Inclusion, financial inclusion had happened. So it was possible for us to reach out to whoever we had to give some money, reach out to those who required food grains, because it's very important. From then till today, we continue the free food grain program for 80 crore Indian citizens. So these are ways in which I suppose pre-pandemic efforts to make Indian economy far more robust with infrastructure framework being ready, not just roads and ports, but also the digital infrastructure, financial inclusion so that everybody has an access to a bank account and so on. So these were things which had happened, which came off handy during the pandemic. But during the pandemic as well, looking at it the other way, not just handling the pandemic, but seeing it as a time of opportunity to continue with the reforms. Whether it is looking at, again, amalgamation of banks, making bigger banks of all that we had, so that Indian economy, which requires greater banks to meet with its aspirations, can have banks. And surprisingly, public sector banks did not allow their client functions to be suffering because of the pandemic, but equally made sure that amalgamations happened without any friction points or pain points. So pandemic was an opportunity to continue with reforms with a greater momentum, whether it is making agriculture sustainable, whether it is making sure that we are able to spend a lot more money on infrastructure, whether it is removing a lot of these archaic laws which were becoming a burden of compliance and rent seeking. So all this happened. So one, pre-pandemic, you didn't expect a pandemic, but you kept doing the right things for people to get included in the financial world and also understanding their requirements. And during the pandemic, you didn't just attend to the pandemic, you didn't just work to get the vaccines, you didn't just make sure that the doctors had the right medicines, so hospitals were fitted with testing labs and so on, but also took the opportunity to keep the reform movement going. If these two have helped us as we were moving out of the pandemic, during the revival, we made sure that enough credit was being made available to all those who need it. MSMEs were particularly given particular care because they were on the verge of facing stress. We gave them timely liquidity assistance without having to provide any new collaterals. And as a result of that, the MSMEs also had the confidence that the government was listening to their needs and responding to them. We changed the definition to help them, provided a moratorium so that they're not taken to the liquidation process. So I suppose too many of reform type steps which were taken during the pandemic kept the economy alive in the sense that they saw the government being responsive, hearing the people in the ground and responding. I suppose these are a few things I'll put forth. Even in the first question, I don't want to take too much of a...
So that's a very important theme in your remarks, Minister, the notion that there were many reforms underway before the pandemic hit, which increased India's resiliency through the pandemic and might have longer-term payoffs. Sticking with the short run for the moment, though, it looks like India is going to have a pretty good 2023. But there are lots of risks out there. It's a very turbulent world we live in. And as we think about the last couple of years, I've been struck by some things about how India has done, which are a little atypical relative to the past. In the past, India was not able to take advantage of a worldwide recovery with exports, and we've seen exports growing very fast. Private sector investment has been doing very well, which again is something that has tended to lag in some of the previous cycles. So there are some very positive elements about the short-term prospects. On the other hand, there are some issues like employment growth, where there is a sense that the economy is not really generating as much as it could in terms of employment. And as we think about connecting the short term to the longer term, with all the favorable demographics that India has, perhaps this is an area where one might need a little more effort. But let me pose to you a more general question. What do you think are the risks over the next year or two? And in terms of these, minor tweaks that could even further improve India's short-term growth performance, do you have anything planned?
You're right in highlighting that there are a lot of risks, and all of them I would, in a very generic fashion, put it as extraneous to Indian economy. They're all things happening outside which are definitely hitting us. And we are every now and then understanding the intensity of this and responding to it. Energy, fertilizer prices. Energy, not just the price, but also the availability. The risks to sourcing of energy. All these are challenges which are not in the medium term, not in the long term, but also in the short term. At a time when all the economies globally are trying to, one, attend to the climate-related risks and had committed themselves during the various COP 21, 22, and so on, as recently as in Scotland. You're looking at a transitional phase where you wanted natural gas to come through. India, of course, has proved that it has kept up the nationally determined commitments as was given in Paris, and it will continue to do that. And the Paris commitments were fulfilled purely and entirely with our own resources. But at this stage, if natural gas is going to be beyond our means, obviously you're looking at reverting to coal to an extent because you need the base level of electricity to be generated. And that just cannot be done only through solar or wind energy. So you are telling yourself, you've given your commitment, you proved that you can fulfill the commitments, but now you're at a risk of having to go back to thermal. Is this right? And this is not a dilemma just for India, it's a dilemma for very many countries. So that is one major challenge for us for the immediate and for the medium term as well. How much more will you ramp up the installed capacity for solar or any other renewable, even if it's nuclear? That is one thing. And second, of course, availability of fertilizer. India is a country which successfully produces almost all that we consume and are also in a position to export. Whether it's milk, whether it is vegetables, fruits, whether it is coarse grains, which is today the golden cereal, the coarse grains are looked up to because they are the wellness-giving grains. All these are abundantly produced in India. But we do need fertilizers. Our soil is fairly fatigued out in some parts. In some other parts, there still are good levels of fertility in the soil. So you need that. Fertilizer is at a great risk. Last year, we had to give 10x the price to import. And obviously, Indian farmers are still not really large farmers. Many of them just have barely enough land with which they produce. I don't want to use the word subsistence farmers. They do produce and they do market as well, or they market the total produce and buy something else. So it's not the classical subsistence farmer. But they need fertilizers at an affordable price. I can't raise the input cost by saying I'm importing it at this price, therefore it is yours to take and take the burden as well. So we have footed the entire price. The farmer pays what he had paid in 2018, 19, 20. Even today, he pays that price in spite of the international price going up. So these are energy, fertilizer, are all becoming expensive. As a result, in some parts of the country, not so much for us, there is severe food insecurity. We are in a position to export. But if our input costs are going up, or if our farmers themselves come under stress, export and the global understanding, multilateral institutional compulsions don't help in exporting food that easily. And this is a bane of some understandings which have been given a play since the Uruguay round. And we've been in every WTO meeting talking about it, saying it shouldn't be so. So these are some of the extraneous stress which will be on all of us. But internally, you did sort of talk about what are the efforts that you're likely to take and how are you going to go about it. Internally, we are making sure credit is available and at an affordable rate. Where it is necessary to give an intervention in the form of interest subvention, we do that so that small and medium businesses can survive. Farmers can get it at an absolutely affordable rate. Similarly, we have also moved to taking the digital thing onto health and education as well, as a result of which access to school, access to learning, better health facilities are all now digitized. So telemedicine is a big thing. Far-flung areas of the country get also better treatment. We're also expanding since 4 years when it was introduced, the medical insurance called the Ayushman Bharat scheme, which is applicable to all the people below poverty and also those who are slightly above poverty line. They get a treatment free without paying cash, without having to produce any paper. In any hospital, private or public, up to 5 lakh rupees per year. So these are measures which we are taking to make sure that the poor are not left without any care. At the same time, the economy, which needs the boost for producing more, gets the boost in our FDI policy, in our industrial policy, producing more within the country for the sake of making sure that our employment is very attended to. You raised the issue of employment. I just want to give you the fact that the National Provident Fund Office, the NPFO as we call it, have a ledger they maintain to show how many net new payment is being made on new enrollments of job. That's actually doubled in the quarter which ends in June. So the first quarter of this year, financial year, has had a doubling of employment. But even as I say that, one last line on employment and in India. The data that has been collected all these years have relied on only surveys and then some kind of an approximation. But equally, today there are government's own periodic surveys which come up with data on labor, formal sector, informal sector, and so on, which give you data to prove that after the pandemic it is improving. But equally, I would like to recognize the fact that there is a good lot of reshaping, recasting which is happening in the Indian economy. A lot of this I can tell you with my own direct conversation with very many industry leaders. Post-2020, post-2021, the second round, the second wave, and the Omicron wave. Very many semi-skilled workers, very many well-skilled workers did not go back to their old employees. We have Mr. Mittal sitting here, he'll be able to speak about it as well. Those who were working in different heavily industrialized parts of the country, they themselves coming from different parts which are not so industrialized, who generically are being called as migrant laborers, went back to their villages. All of us knew about how they went back. Some of them went back with the trains which were provided, others found their own way. But when the pandemic subsided, and when they had all been given also the vaccinations, many of them didn't go back to their old employees. They went looking for better jobs and found them, and therefore there is this good churn that is happening in the Indian economy, and therefore the government's effort for skilling and upskilling is also being ramped up now. And the nature of employment itself is now also getting very speedily ramped up. And that is why I'm not surprised, and I'm glad to quote, Honorable Prime Minister mentioned that India probably can lead the Industrial Revolution 4.0. When he said that, what he indicated is, in many industries in a country like India today have already gone into artificial intelligence. They're bringing technology-driven production. Shop floors have more robots than humans in some areas, and therefore there's a churn. So the long and short of employment-related question will have to wait for time to see where who is going back as what, and is he also working together with machine and machine's intelligence rather than just manually.
There are two very important observations that were embedded in what you said. Number one is that India is beginning to reveal some of its dynamism, and I think we've seen that just in the last couple of years when exports from the high-skill, high-technology sector have been doing very well, and the private investment going to that part of the economy has been doing very well as well. And I also endorse your implicit view that we should have better data to measure what is really happening in such a dynamic economy, although that, of course, is particularly complicated. Minister, you talked about various parts of the reform agenda, and certainly over the last few years, especially during your time as finance minister, we've seen a lot of long-standing reform hopes of many people, including myself, beginning to come to fruition. You spoke a little bit about what has been happening with financial sector reforms, and of course, the digitization, which is leading to more inclusion. We've seen progress on labor reforms after a long time. On land and agricultural reforms, I know there have been some hiccups, but it seems that there is some progress where there has been some expenditure reforms. What do you see as the real unfinished reform agenda, and what are the key reform priorities of your government in the coming years?
I don't want to sound abstract in my answer that I want to give. Reform has become so much of a fixation of 91, post 1991, when Indian economy got opened up. You had a list of things to do, and they were your first generation reforms. Then after that, there was a second generation of reforms, again, which had a certain set of listed out items. The first set of reforms themselves, if you go by that kind of a listing, were not completed in 91 to 95, 96, or even and the 10 years, for whatever reason. The second set obviously depended on getting the first set completed and then touching the second. So as a result, you've reached a stage in India, you had reached a stage in India when it looked as if reforms were matters for discussion, but it'll never get executed. But I think from 2000, the virtue of making your economy even more simpler in conduct process, and therefore opening up truly, was made into a rather real-time, robust process. It's not as if I've done A from the list 1 and B from list 2, I've done some reforms. They will have to be done, and now they have become old, or generation 1 of the reform, whereas generation 3 is upon us, and are we doing that as well is the question. So when you ask me, what are the reforms you still have to do, it is a process which I have to keep doing and carrying it forward. So it's not just sufficient if I privatize a company here or there, but even looking at some of the core sectors, which we have announced during the 2021 budget, which spoke about public sector enterprises. We opened up all the sectors for private sector to come in. There was no one area totally reserved for public sector to be present. Everything was opened up. That was not even listed reform. We've done it. But then what happens to the public sector units which are already there in those areas? Do you want to keep them? Do you don't want to keep them? We said only in 4 different areas will public sector be present at all. And they will be present minimally. So now we are also trying to remove those excesses, overgrowths, and prime those public sector which per policy will have to be minimally present in some areas only, like telecommunication. There will be at least one public sector head company, which means the others will have to be either amalgamated, sold off, strategically disinvested, or see ways in which they can become far more professionally run. So these are also happening as we are going on. Electricity is going through a major reformatory process, because electricity has a foot with where the states are, the other one is with the center. Generation happens from the center, some generation happens at the state, but the distribution happens at the state level. The payment processes have all been vitiated. So in a way, reform is going through steadily and continuously. It's not as if we've done that and the story ended there. That will have a 3rd generation reform, which I still have to attend. We are committed and we are going through it. And that is why you find even some of those archaic laws had to be removed because they're becoming very strong instruments of rent seeking. We didn't want that. Electricity reform is one other, which I said. Banking, insurance sector are also being now primed. So these will continue.
Okay, so that seems like a fairly ambitious set of steps that you still have in mind. As one thinks about the specific reform areas that are most closely connected to your domain, fiscal policy in the last couple of years has been very supportive in terms of growth, and I think the measures had very positive effects in terms of propping up growth at a very difficult time and in buffering the parts of the economy that were suffering. And I also have to note that the way you speak about these policies is very different from the way I, as a macroeconomist, think about them in terms of dry data. You always seem to speak about what effects these have on the poor, the common people, and so on. And
is that Brookings telling me?
No, it's
I
just
thought you had a.
It's just me as a macroeconomist. I tend to think about these somewhat more dryly, but I can see that the way you talk about these policies, you're thinking about the micro effects rather than just the macroeconomic angles. But going back to the fiscal issue, again, there are some macro realities one has to deal with. So if one looked at the central government deficit, it's been around 7%, depending on how you measure it the last couple of years. The general government deficit is in small double digits. But of course, you have a public debt that is about 90% of GDP. Now, at one level, the public debt doesn't seem like a major concern in terms of sustainability because, if you're generating growth of about 6 to 7% and the real interest rate is below that, it's not a major sustainability issue. But I know that following the Finance Commission's recommendations, you do have a specific plan to bring down the deficit. Could you talk a little bit more about those plans and how they square up with the needs of the Indian economy in terms of the support that is necessary to keep growth going and to act as a bulwark for the reforms?
See, 2020 saw us having to borrow and spend. Borrow also on behalf of the states because of the GST commitments that had been given in the name of 14% compensation which would be given. So those were borrowed by us, but then obviously they are states borrowing because we borrowed it and back to back sent it to them. So 2020, both for center and the states was a very difficult year, and borrowing did spike, and no one could have questioned that borrowing. And subsequently in 21, we also made sure that capital expenditure, public, would be substantially high because for the economy to revive, we needed to spend from the government for infrastructure, capital asset creation, because we believe that multiplier is what is going to help the economy to revive, not spend through revenue expenditure. I've quoted this number a lot of times. I'll repeat it because money spent on infrastructure building, capital expenditure, has a multiplier of 2.4 for every rupee spent. Whereas if you were to spend it as a revenue expenditure, it gives you less than a rupee, something like 0.9599 for every rupee spent. So we understood the virtue of spending on asset creation, and that is why we went through that route, and even that required some borrowing. But that budget post the pandemic, even if we hadn't come out of it, we very clearly showed the deficit where it was, didn't do any under the carpet business or playing around with it, openly stated where we were, and also gave ourselves a glide path, saying this is how we will come back to the level that is acceptable in terms of fiscal deficit. We've not strayed away from it. Although after 2020, the 21 budget gave a 34% increase in public spending and infrastructure. A similar increase was also made in this budget, February 1st, 2022. Even with all that, we remain committed to maintaining the fiscal deficit guide path that we've given. So that is one of the ways in which I think we are conscious in prudentially managing the finances.
So you have a budget coming up in February, and it's going to be an important budget because it's India coming out of the pandemic, as you said, on a glide path in terms of fiscal sustainability, but also thinking about the medium term. Would you care to talk about what priorities you might have in the budget in terms of specific expenditure or revenue measures?
Specific may be difficult at this stage because it's a bit too early. But broadly, the growth priorities will be kept absolutely on the top. Even as I speak about the concerns that inflation brings before me. So inflation concerns will have to be addressed, but then how would you manage growth would be the natural question. But that's the point of, being sure how you're going to be able to balance the two and be sure that the momentum that Indian economy has got coming out of the pandemic and the momentum with which it will grow even the next year, even as per the very many multilateral institutions which are observing India, cannot be weakened. So it will have to again be a very carefully structured budget in which the growth momentum will have to be sustained.
You spoke in some detail about the financial inclusion effects, underpinned by Aadhaar, but which the world knows as the India stack, and also there were a number of measures taken during the last couple of years to protect, especially the economically underprivileged. So, as we get out of this difficult period, think about the medium term. Are there other measures or plans you have to think about, raising the level of standard of living, particularly of those at the bottom end of the economic spectrum, and making sure that they have better protection from the sort of risks that they face related to agricultural shocks, related to unemployment shocks, and so forth?
I suppose the way in which we responded between last year, sometime June, till this year's March, April, will give you an indication of how we are planning to handle that. The global stress that hits us, the energy or fertilizer or on food, all of this we are carefully watchful and making sure that that stress doesn't get passed on to the people. That is why once before Deepavali last year, October, November, and once in early June this year, the excise duty on fuel was brought down so that the common citizen doesn't bear the brunt of increasing fuel prices. That is one way in which we're making sure that those at the vulnerable sections don't get hurt. Giving food was another. Equally, making sure that if they take money for meeting the input costs, they're also given interest subvention, so they pay minimum. But the larger principle of doing all this is looking at the poor and giving them support in such a way that it empowers them, so that the next stage would be for them to take care that the family's needs are taken care of. Would they spend money in giving further education to the child? Would they seek some kind of assistance if there is health? Health is getting covered under the insurance. A lot of scholarships have been given for education. So empowering is the principle rather than entitlement. Now, entitlement is very easy because the moment you give the money, you can always check that box and say, I've done it, money's gone there. But that's not the way in which we want to deal. We are going layer by layer, top to bottom, and making sure across the board, everybody gets covered from the sense of you're entitled on some matters, but majorly we are attending to you so that you have your house, you have drinking water, your sanitation needs are taken care of, you're given a proper electricity connection, And at the end of the day, therefore, the family feels empowered enough to take care of, providing other assistance to the members of the family. All that which hadn't happened in these many decades. So the principle of entitlement versus empowerment is what is governing us when we deal with schemes which will touch the vulnerable sections.
So if I may take you from thinking about the common man to thinking on a global scale right now, in December of this year, India takes over the G20 presidency, and it's a very fraught time in the world. There are lots of economic uncertainties out there, but also it's geopolitically a time with a great deal of tensions, and the world seems to be, getting pulled apart by many of these forces. And India has taken a neutral stance on many of these issues. So, do you have any plans for using the G20, presidency to sort of try and bring the world together? And more generally, what are your priorities for the G20 presidency?
You're right. This is a very challenging time to, inherit from Indonesia the chair and work together. We'll be working very closely together with the membership so that, I'm only indicating broadly the kind of areas in which the time demands that we work to achieve some of these outcomes. Multilateral institutions need to be strengthened. Their capacity to deal with pandemic or any future such stressful global developments will have to be bettered. We need to have finance to deal with, any future pandemic or disaster. Climate-related disasters are now becoming far more frequent than we could imagine. Resilient infrastructure is required. Do we know how we can handle cloudbursts or sinking islands and so on? And climate finance has not been something which has been smooth. A lot of talk has happened, but really has not seen the light of the day. So I think we have issues which are, one, the legacy issues which are coming from various different presidencies, some of which will have to be carried further. But I think multilateral institutions and their strength will have to be talked about. It's just not a coincidence that the earlier presidency, our presidency, and the one next will all be emerging from the emerging markets. So their voice, their priorities will also have to find some kind of a traction. And I would also think it's important for the global issues to be sorted out. Institutions should be robust to give solutions. We find in the last few decades, institutions have existed, but problems remain. Solutions are not coming through them. So make them far more effective to work together. In that, I think G20 has a particularly unique role to play. You found that solution for global taxation on multinational companies which are existing in one area but also generating money from a different area, the two-pillar solution, which came through from the G20. So G20 has a great potential to work towards global goods, and global, when I say public goods, will also have to be made far more strengthened. India's stack, for instance, can become a global stack, efficient cross-border payments, cheaper, remittances, are all the benefits which we can derive out of it. So these are some of the areas in which I would want the G20 to work together. We love to work together with them and get some good outcomes.
So some of my colleagues here, like Dr. Qureshi, Dr. Bhattacharya, and of course Dr. Coulibaly, tear their hairs out in the process of trying to, bring more logic to the G20 process. You seem to have faith that these institutions that we have need to be modified, but are still going to be able to meet the challenges here. Do you think any substantial institutional reform in the sense of new institutions might be needed, or just modifications of what we now have?
I'm not against new institutions, but if there are institutions which have been with us and we know where their problems are, won't it be easier for us to remove the problems and make them far more efficient? Equally, you can found new institutions, nobody is against it, but you have institutions, and there has been some sense of comfort since after the Second World War We said we knew how to handle our money, our finances, our economies, our trade, everything. But suddenly we also think they've not stood up to face the challenges of the times. We need to have these institutions really revived and to serve the purpose for which they have been established. You need newer ones, please do. From the lessons learned from how these have become less effective, we need to make them more effective as well. So the job is doubly there as much as reviving these and giving them new leash of life. So I suppose those of us who want new institutions, welcome, please do. But do learn the lessons of what happened in the last decades.
Yeah, I guess that is a critical issue. If we do have new institutions, we certainly need better ones than the ones we have right now. We've covered a lot of ground, Minister, but maybe we'll just open it up to a couple of questions from the audience. If you're asking a question, please remember that this is the Finance Minister who has responsibility for financial and economic issues. Also, please identify yourself, just your name and affiliation, and no statements, please. 1 or 2 sentences, and it has to be a precise question, please.
I'm Sundi Natarajan from TIDC. So India has created a lot of unicorns of late, and that's one of the biggest things that's been achieved. What's also happening is most of these unicorns, after some time, move out of India, losing opportunity to actually create more jobs and also the comfort feeling for investors to actually invest in India. So these companies move to Dubai, Singapore, some of them to US. So what could be done to come up with a win-win? So these companies actually grow and are able to actually create the maximum impact through the whole life cycle.
Let's maybe take a couple more questions and then the Minister can answer them in some conference. Yes, sir. Could we get a mic here? Actually, why don't you give the mic to that lady there? Let's take that question and then we'll come here.
Good afternoon. My name is Anjana and I'm from Northeast part of India. So I have a question regarding the Northeast. So in the Northeast, incubation hubs like Nest that needs to be increased. And currently it is in the state level. And what is the plan to get into the more like a, district level or probably to the blocks?
Yes, sir. A mic here, please.
So sorry, our mic is not working.
Sorry.
I am Guru Singh. I am a former World Bank executive. I'm not an economist, but of course an illustrator. I've seen you a couple of days back in buying vegetables. And I was just wanted to know these issues which we are hearing for the last 20 years. Low per capita, high inflation, huge population pressure, of course, so this pandemic issues are coming. Thank you. And inequality of wealth in India.
What is your question, sir?
And poor quality of human capital. So I'm just would like you to answer these questions if it is possible. I know you have covered a couple of.
Okay, thank you,
sir.
sir.
Like to listen to this.
I think your question is clear. Let's take one more question from that lady over there. Okay, go ahead. We'll take both ladies. Please keep your questions sharp. And
talking about the dream of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, doubling of farmers' income, where are we standing currently and what are the challenges we see apart from the fertilizers you said? Because I work with NASA Harvest and we do the global agriculture monitoring using satellite remote sensing. So I would love to know if we can help in that.
Okay, and one last question from that lady there.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us about everything. So I'm a student at the University of Maryland here. And I'm really proud of our UPI system in India. I just wanted to ask, what do you think are the future plans for the UPI system and how can we share it with the world? Like specifically in the US, that's what I miss the most about India, not having a UPI system in the US. So thank you.
That's true, Minister. We certainly need to get some Indian expertise here. Our payment systems are not great. So the questions seem to be about unicorns, about innovation hubs, about human capital. So maybe you can give us a brief overview of your thoughts on these matters.
See, on the startups and unicorns, since 2015, when the Prime Minister made it a point to encourage and overtly support those who want to set up startups in India, also to give them all institutional backup, whether by setting up incubation centers or later day financing and so on. Between 15 and 20, you saw them grow, and we've maintained consistently our position as third largest ecosystem for startups. And in that period, I have engaged, Prime Minister himself has engaged with the startups to know what they want from India, and we kept as much as possible addressing their concerns. Now, as a result of which, not purely as a result of which, but also because of which, you saw unicorns coming to reach 100 in number within 1 year of 2020 and 2021. All at one go, you saw one after the other. Now, I've heard this from others as well. They're moving to Singapore, they're moving to UAE. Well, if they want to talk to the government of India and say, look, we were moving to Singapore, but if you were to do this, we'll quite happily be here. And if after hearing it, if it's possible, we'll certainly attend to them. So I would think continuous engagement with the startups is what is going to help for them to, one, remain and do better within India. But if there are temptations for which they would want to go outside, we need to understand how much we can entertain and serve on those scores. Not all of them are possible, but equally we can try. Northeast, I think I will dare say this, that in the last several decades, the prominence that Northeast has been given by the current government between 2014 and now is one of the most exhaustive. More can be done, more is being done, more will be continued to be done. But as regards startups in the Northeast, I remember myself having had meetings with chief ministers of those regions about startups, and IIT Guwahati particularly has a lot of interaction with industry and also encourages by throwing up challenges for the startups to come up with solutions. And as a result, I find in the Northeast there's a unique, very typical for the Northeast kind of solutions emanating from startups which are coming up in that area. Now, the point that you mentioned about taking it down to the districts and the blocks and something like that, as it is in our policy, even as we started talking about startup, there was one announcement made called the Stand Up India. I don't know if you're familiar with it. That was to take the startup revolution to the rural areas. And that through the banks, where every branch of every bank, largely public sector banks, wherever they are present, were mandated to give assistance to an innovative entrepreneur in that area. They could come from SC, meaning the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, or more importantly, even women. So not only taking it to the block level or district level, wherever the branch is there, they had to give assistance for startups in that local area. It's already happening through that government scheme. It has to widen itself, of course, but it's happening. I think many of the issues that you raised were addressed in terms of handling inflation, in terms of making sure the pressure is not on the common citizen of growing input costs, growing inflation because of extraneous factors and so on. So I suppose if I were to carve it out from various different answers that I've given, it'll probably address the issue that you've raised. Farmers' income and doubling of income is a promise that we've given, and we are carefully attending to it. I can see Honorable Ashok Gulati ji, who's done a lot of work on agriculture here. I've even attended quite a few of his programs. By providing facility for the farmers to have solar panels in their fields, in the hedges of their fields, and also rooftops, people have realized that not only can they save on fuel costs, energy costs, but they can also sell that through linking with the grid is one of the steps through which I use the expression Annadata can also be Urja Data, meaning that person who's producing food can also produce energy. So that's also giving them some income. The Prime Minister brought in a scheme of Kisan Samman Nidhi, through which every farmer gets 6,000 rupees in 3 installments through the year. That reaches them. They are given crop loan at an incentivized rate. So that can cut the input costs and therefore give some saving to the family. Also now the cost of the fertilizer being what they are, there is a great movement within the country to use nano fertilizers, which are minimal use but maximum revenue. And that nano fertilizer are largely produced within the country. The capacity of producing nano fertilizers are being ramped up, and as a result, we think the input costs of farmers will come down. Other than that, farmers are being given incentive to keep bees produce honey in their fields. If they had additionally kept a cow or a couple of milk yielding animals, they are given a Kisan credit card for that. They can go to the banks and get concessional credit. So that is being extended to those who keep cows or bovine animals, goats, piggery, fish in a pond or in a river. So the farmer is now perceived as not just the one who goes, tills this land and produce crops and seeks to get a fair price, but there are so many other ways in which he is now being facilitated. We are also allowing farmers to form groups called Farmer Producer Organizer, and they are allowed to make a profit out of the functions that they undertake as FPOs. FPOs are given rights to procure, aggregate the crop, store in the village. For storage capacity, we are giving viability gap funding. So the farmers and their wives or any member of the family can become the store, the silo owner, earn money out of it. So farmer producer organizations nowadays start aggregating produce of that area and not sell at a distressed price. Sure enough, immediately after the harvest, he's not going to get good rate. But if he has better storage, he gets a better rate. So doubling the income doesn't confine itself to only that crop or the land-based activity that he's doing, but everything else that he does, being there as a farmer, is also being brought in. So
thank you, Minister.
Did I miss that last question, lady?
About the UPI, I think that's certainly true that we need.
I'm glad to hear that. Actually, you said the second thing as well, which was going to be my answer. In that we are talking to different countries. Singapore, UAE have all come forward now to make RuPay acceptable in their countries. Not just that, the UPI, the BMAP and everything else, NCPI, are all now being worked in such a way that their systems in their respective country, however robust or otherwise, can talk to our system, and the interoperability itself will give strength for Indians' expertise in those countries. We are working together with several countries.
Thank you, Minister Sitharaman. We really appreciate the time you took to come to Brookings and share these perspectives with us. It's been a very rich discussion, and I think we're all left with a sense of a couple of things: your mastery of detail and also your empathy for the common man or woman, which I think is a very good portent that India's economic destiny is in good hands. And I think all of us at Brookings and all of us here, of course, are cheering on India, both in terms of its economic prospects, but also in the context of its G20 mission to perhaps try and bring the world together. And on a personal note, I should also note that in addition to your work as a policymaker, I've been a long admirer of your commitment, your lifelong commitment to gender equality and to education, both causes that I know that you've spent a lot of time and effort on. And most importantly, thank you in these very dark times for leaving us with a sense of optimism about India and the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you.